entire cheerleading squad made up of spirited young girls from Arizona vanished without a trace in 1995, shortly after a performance. What began as a night of celebration ended in a silence that echoed for decades. Their disappearance left behind grieving parents, endless questions, and a community forever changed. Then, 2 decades later, a lone hiker stumbled upon something buried deep in the desert that would challenge everything known about the case. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen windows of the Green home in Chandler, Arizona, illuminating the breakfast table where Marissa Green sat quietly. Her husband David sat across from her, sipping coffee and flipping through the newspaper. Though the day began like any other, it carried the weight of 2 decades of uncertainty. Ever since their twin daughters, April and Amber, had disappeared, mornings had never truly been ordinary. They would be 34 now. Marissa's thoughts often drifted to who they might have become. Would they be mothers? What would their voices sound like as adults? These thoughts haunted her, though she had learned to live with the ache of not knowing. The sharp vibration of her phone against the table broke the silence. Expecting a text from a support group friend, or perhaps a reminder from work, she glanced down and froze. "David," she said, barely a whisper. "It's Detective Holbrook." David immediately looked up, eyes wide. Detective Liam Holbrook had led the original investigation into the girl's disappearance until the case had gone cold. Hearing from him now felt surreal. "Answer it," David urged. Marissa took a breath, answered the call, and placed it on speaker. "Mrs. Green?" Holbrook said, his voice familiar but aged. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," she replied quickly. "Is something wrong?" "We've had a significant development in your daughter's case," he said, voice steady but edged with urgency. "What kind of development?" Marissa asked, her throat tightening. "I can't go into details over the phone," he replied gently. "Can you and your husband come to the station?" David leaned in. "We'll be there right away." As the call ended, the kitchen fell silent. Neither moved at first, suspended in a moment where hope threatened to break through their long-standing grief. Marissa couldn't voice the question in her heart. David reached across and squeezed her hand. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together." They left quickly. The drive to the Chandler Police Department felt both endless and immediate. Marissa watched the familiar streets fly by, noting how much the city had changed. New buildings, roads, a landscape their daughters wouldn't recognize. "I didn't think we'd ever hear from him again," she said. "I never stopped waiting," David admitted. When they arrived, the parking lot was busier than usual. Marissa recognized several cars. "The other families are here too," she said, her pulse quickening. Inside, the receptionist gave them a familiar, sympathetic smile and guided them to a conference room. 4 other sets of parents sat inside. The Thompsons, the Lees, Susan Collins, and the Riveras, all united by the same shared loss. Detective Holbrook stood at the front. He looked older, hair streaked with gray, but his demeanor was steady. "Mr. and Mrs. Green," he said with a nod, "please have a seat." Once everyone had settled, Holbrook began. "Thank you all for coming. Early this morning, a hiker discovered something in the Sonoran Desert we believe is connected to your daughter's disappearance." He turned to a laptop and brought up an image on the screen, a rusted suitcase partially unearthed beneath a flat rock. The lid was open, revealing weathered red and white fabric. "Care uniforms," Susan Collins gasped. Marissa leaned forward. Even through the dust and time, the fabric was unmistakable. It was the same type of uniform April and Amber had worn the night they vanished. "The hiker was with his dog," Holbrook explained. "They were far from any marked trail. The dog caught a scent and began digging. That's when he found this suitcase." David spoke, trying to keep his voice calm. "Where exactly?" "About 35 miles from the nearest trail," Holbrook said, pointing to a map. "It's isolated. People don't go there often." Marissa's stomach turned. "Is it confirmed that it belonged to our daughters?" "Not yet," Holbrook said, "but the initial evidence is strong. Inside the suitcase were not only uniforms but a few personal items, jewelry, a torn page from a journal, and photos." Linda Thompson leaned forward. "What kind of photos?" "Amel shows a group of girls, in uniforms, possibly inside a cave. The photo is dated June 1995. A stunned silence followed. Judith Lee's eyes welled with tears. Susan Collins whispered, "That's when they disappeared." Holbrook nodded. "We think they may have been held somewhere nearby." David clenched his fists. "Are you saying they were alive for a time?" Holbrook hesitated. "We don't know how long, but the evidence suggests they didn't die right away." A heavy quiet settled over the room. The idea that their daughters may have survived, if only for a time, was almost too much to bear. "What now?" asked Michael Lee. "A forensic team is at the site," said Holbrook. "We're collecting all possible evidence. We've also reopened the case and are working with criminal profilers." He handed each family a folder containing copies of the found photograph and initial notes. "I know this is painful," he said, "but this could finally lead us to the truth." Outside, as the Greens stepped back into the Arizona sun, Marissa held the photo in her hands. It was faded, grainy, but the two girls pictured were unmistakably her daughters. They stood side by side, arms around each other, faces tired, but alive. "They might had each other," she whispered. David nodded. "Maybe they held on. Maybe they believed we'd come for them." Back in their car, Marissa held the folder close to her chest, as though it were something sacred. The desert heat shimmered off the windshield, but neither of them moved. It was as if they were still processing the meaning of what they'd just seen and heard. "I always thought," Marissa said softly, "that if we ever found something, it would be definitive, clear, closure. But this opens more questions than it answers." David nodded slowly. "But it's something. For the first time in years, we're not sitting in the dark." She opened the folder again and stared at the photo. It was worn, edges curled, but the image remained powerful. The cavern setting looked barren, cold. The girls' expressions were a mix of defiance and fear. Despite everything, they had leaned into each other. "It's like they were sending us a message," she said, "that they hadn't given up." The thought both comforted and crushed her. If they'd been alive, if they'd waited for rescue, and no one had come in time. David placed a hand on her knee. "We didn't fail them. We never stopped looking. We did everything we could with what we had." Marissa wiped her eyes and looked out the window. The city buzzed with life, people running errands, students crossing intersections, kids riding bikes. Life went on even when your world stood still. "Emily deserved more," she said. "We'll get them justice," David replied firmly, "whatever it takes." Marissa could see in his eyes that the situation was grave. "About 30 miles outside Chandler," Detective Holbrook explained, clicking to another image. It displayed a barren, sun-beaten expanse of the Sonoran Desert where the suitcase had been unearthed. "We've already dispatched a forensic team to secure and analyze the area." "We need to go there," Marissa said suddenly, her voice steady and resolute. The words surprised even her. After years of helplessness, she needed to witness this moment firsthand. The other parents murmured their agreement, nodding urgently. Holbrook looked conflicted. "That's not necessary," he replied. "We're bringing the contents to the lab. The hiker who found the suitcase is coming in today to give a formal statement." "Please," Linda Thompson interrupted, her voice cracking. "After 20 years of nothing, no leads, no answers, we need to see it for ourselves." Detective Holbrook surveyed the faces before him and sighed. "Let me check with the team in the field," he said, stepping out of the room with his phone in hand. The room buzzed with hushed speculation once he was gone. Marissa barely heard a word. Her thoughts spiraled. Why now? Why bury the uniforms in such a shallow grave, and after so many years? Holbrook returned several minutes later. "The team says you can come," he said, "but you'll need to follow protocol. Stay behind the tape, don't touch anything, and follow officers' instructions." "Thank you," Marissa said, exhaling relief. "We'll follow you there," David added. "We leave in 15 minutes, Holbrook confirmed. "It's about an hour's drive." As the group left the station, Marissa felt a strange blend of fear and hope. 2 decades of waiting might finally lead to something real. She squeezed David's hand tightly. No matter what lay ahead, they would face it together. Their convoy followed Holbrook's unmarked vehicle as it led them away from the familiar streets of Chandler and into the desert. The road gradually shifted from suburban comfort to open wilderness, with low shrubs and rugged terrain stretching out under the blistering sun. Marissa stared out the window, her thoughts pulled to the night it all began. It had been a regional cheerleading event. April and Amber were radiant, confident, joyful, and full of life. They had called home to celebrate their second-place win, promising to phone again before heading back. That second call never came. When the cars reached the site, the sun stood high overhead, baking the cracked desert soil. They parked near a few police cruisers beside a makeshift dirt lot. Holbrook led them on foot down a winding half-mile trail until a white tent came into view, surrounded by yellow crime scene tape. Officers and forensic techs moved about, collecting evidence and snapping photos. To the side stood a man and his dog. "This is Chris Delaney," said Holbrook. "He's the one who found the suitcase, and that's Dusty." Chris, a rugged man with sun-weathered skin, stepped forward. "I wish we were meeting under better circumstances," he said, shaking each parent's hand. "Thank you," Marissa told him, her voice trembling. "You have no idea how much this means to us." Chris gave a small nod. "Dusty's the real hero. He caught a scent and wouldn't let up. Started digging like mad until I saw the edge of the suitcase." Dusty, a clever-eyed Australian Shepherd Labrador mix, sat loyally beside him. "Can we see it?" David asked. Holbrook nodded and led them under the white tent. The suitcase had been carefully placed on a folding table. The red and white cheer uniforms inside were weathered but unmistakably familiar. A forensic tech nearby explained, "The condition of the items suggests they were buried within the past year." Peter Rivera looked stunned. "But the girls vanished 2 decades ago." "That's what makes this so strange," Holbrook agreed. "It seems the burial was rushed, the stone cover wasn't heavy, and the depth was shallow, like someone didn't think anyone would come this far." As the parents gathered around the table, silent and reverent, a new movement in the distance caught Marissa's attention. Vehicles approached. One was a news van, the other a familiar sedan. When the second car parked and the driver stepped out, Marissa's breath caught. "Vincent Carraway," she said aloud. It was the girls' old cheer coach. He approached briskly, older now, with silver at his temples, but still upright and purposeful. "Marissa!" "David," he called as he reached them. "I came as soon as I heard." Holbrook greeted him with a handshake. "Coach, thanks for coming on such short notice." Carraway returned the handshake with intensity. "When it's about my girls, I don't wait around." Marissa watched the coach closely. Something was unsettling about his timing. Why had he shown up so quickly? Had he seen the news, or been contacted by someone inside the department? She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his arrival than simple concern. David seemed to sense her unease. "You heard already?" he asked Carraway. "I have friends in the department," he replied smoothly. "Word travels fast when it's about something like this. I had to be here. Those girls were like family." Chris Delaney and Dusty stepped aside as the officers allowed the parents and the coach a closer view under the tent. Everyone stood in solemn silence, examining the suitcase and the items within it. The uniforms had been carefully arranged, though visibly aged. Threadbare patches, rust-like stains, and faded team logos told of long-buried memories. Among the items was a small, broken locket, half open, revealing a miniature photo of 2 girls, Marissa's daughters. She gasped. "That's April's! I gave it to her the day of the competition." A forensic tech stepped forward. "Ma'am, we'll be taking these to the lab later today for DNA and material analysis. We'll handle everything with care." Marissa nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. Beside her, Susan Collins held her hand to her mouth. "Do you think they were kept nearby? All these years?" Holbrook answered gently, "It's a possibility we're actively investigating. The presence of recently disturbed soil, coupled with the lack of long-term weathering on the uniforms, suggests they were buried here not long ago." Michael Lee asked what everyone was thinking. So someone held on to these items for 20 years and only just buried them now? "Yes," Holbrook confirmed. "And that's the part that's hardest to explain. Someone went out of their way to hide this, but not very well, almost like they were in a hurry. Or scared." Attention settled over the group. If the items had only recently been hidden, who had kept them all these years, and why choose now to dispose of them? A voice interrupted the thoughts. It was Caraway again. "Is there any sign the girls were here recently? Any evidence they were alive past that night?" "We don't know yet," Holbrook replied, "but the fact that the items weren't buried 20 years ago suggests the story didn't end in 1995. Chris Delaney added, "Dusty didn't just find the suitcase. He was fixated on the area, circling, sniffing. There may be more. I told the team to keep sweeping. There could be other evidence nearby." The parents exchanged looks, anxious, terrified, hopeful. It felt like they stood on the edge of a revelation, yet the ground beneath them remained uncertain. Marissa stepped away for a moment, looking out across the endless desert horizon. Her daughters had vanished into this wilderness, and now something, perhaps a message, had resurfaced. What had happened to them out here? Who had hidden these items? And what would come next? Behind her, the forensic team packed up the suitcase for transport. Officers directed media vans to remain at a distance, shielding the families from invasive questions and camera lenses. As they prepared to leave, Marissa turned to Chris and Dusty once more. "I can't thank you enough." Chris gave a quiet nod. "I just hope it helps. I hope this leads somewhere." Detective Holbrook walked over. "We'll be in touch as soon as we know more. Right now, the lab is our next stop. Once we process the items, we'll cross-reference them with everything from the original case." Marissa looked back one final time at the tent before getting into the car with David. In that suitcase, buried in sand and secrecy, lay the first real lead in 2 decades. She clutched David's hand, the weight of 20 years of grief and yearning shifting just slightly. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of the end of their waiting. Vincent Caraway, even after all these years, still referred to the missing cheerleaders as his girls. His dedication hadn't faded with time. Back in the early days of the investigation, when media coverage was constant and leads came pouring in, he had used every connection and resource at his disposal to keep momentum going, even as police scaled back their efforts. He had organized search parties, spoken at community events, and offered rewards from his savings. For Caraway, the case had never truly gone cold. Detective Holbrook gathered the families near the edge of the investigation site. "We've decided to notify the media about this discovery," he said. "This case touched the entire community. Hundreds of people volunteered during those early search efforts. They deserve to know that something's finally been found." Marissa turned and watched reporters setting up near the perimeter. A young female correspondent was already speaking with an officer, nodding earnestly as she received what little information had been released. Cameramen were adjusting tripods. The air was thick with anticipation. Caraway moved closer to the table, holding the rusted suitcase. He stood over it in silence, staring at the red and white uniforms. His expression was unreadable, but the tightness in his jaw betrayed his inner turmoil. "After all these years," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else, "I never gave up. Not for a moment." He turned and walked over to Chris Delaney, who stood quietly with Dusty at the edge of the tent. Extending a hand, Caraway's voice took on a rare softness. "Thank you," he said earnestly. "Your discovery might finally give us the answers we've waited decades for." Chris nodded, clearly moved. "Just glad Dusty insisted on digging. He's stubborn when he finds a scent." Caraway then circulated among the parents, offering warm handshakes and comforting pats on the shoulder. When he reached Marissa and David, his voice dropped. "It's been a long time," he said gently. "How are you holding up?" "As well as can be expected," David replied. "We heard you left the school?" "I did," Caraway said, nodding. "About 10 years ago. Too many memories. But I still coach. Started my program, train private squads now." Before the conversation could continue, a young reporter with a cameraman approached. "We'd like to speak with the families if that's okay," she said, looking to Holbrook for approval. "Hummel at a time," Holbrook instructed, "and keep it brief." The interviews began. Each family took a turn in front of the cameras, sharing their thoughts and emotions with the public. Most expressed cautious hope that this new evidence might finally shed light on the fate of their daughters. Susan Collins broke down midway through her segment, her voice catching as she spoke Rachel's name aloud. When it was their turn, Marissa and David stood hand in hand before the camera. The reporter gave a polite smile. "Mrs. Green, how does it feel to have a new lead after 2 decades?" Marissa took a long breath. "It's overwhelming. We've never stopped looking for our daughters, never stopped hoping. If April and Amber can hear this, if they're out there somewhere, we want them to know that we're still searching. We will never stop. And Mr. Green, what do you hope comes from this discovery?" David's voice was composed, though Marissa could feel the subtle tremble in his hand. "At the very least, we hope for closure. But what we want is what every parent in our position wants: to find our children alive and bring them home." After their interview concluded, Marissa realized she had left her camera and water bottle in the car. "I want to take a few proper pictures of the site," she said to David. "My phone won't capture enough detail." "I'll come with you," David offered. They informed Holbrook of their plan. "That's fine," he said. "Just stay on the path you came in on. The desert can be disorienting, and the last thing we need is another missing persons report." They nodded and began walking back toward the makeshift parking area. The midday sun bore down relentlessly, heat waves shimmering above the sand. As they moved along the narrow trail, Marissa scanned the surrounding terrain. Then something in the distance caught her eye. "David," she whispered, touching his arm, "look over there." Just beyond a low ridge, partially hidden by brush, was a truck. 2 men were nearby. One was dragging something heavy toward the truck bed. The other appeared to be crouching behind a cluster of rocks, occasionally glancing around nervously. "I see them," David said, squinting. "There's someone in the driver's seat, too." "What are they doing out here?" Marissa asked, her voice tense. "This is way off the main trail." David hesitated. "Could be off-roaders. Or campers taking a break." Marissa shook her head. "No, something feels wrong. Why would someone be dragging a heavy sack in this heat? And why hide behind rocks?" Without waiting for his response, she veered off the path and began walking toward the truck. "Marissa," David hissed, catching up to her, "what are you doing? Holbrook said not to leave the trail." "I just want to see what they're up to," she said, quickening her pace. "Something's not right. This is dangerous. We should get the detective." "By the time we get back, they could be gone," she argued. "I need to know if this is connected to our daughters." As they got closer, the men by the truck noticed them. Marissa raised a hand. "Hello there," she called out. The reaction was instant. The men shouted to one another. The one dragging the sack heaved it into the truck bed. The other sprinted from behind the rocks, gripping what looked like a shovel. All 3 scrambled into the vehicle, which roared to life and sped away, kicking up a thick cloud of dust. "Did you see that?" Marissa gasped. "They ran." David nodded grimly, watching the dust cloud dissipate in the distance. They were up to something. That wasn't just off-roading. Marissa's mind raced. The sack, the way they bolted, the location. Remote, and near where evidence had just been uncovered. "We have to tell Holbrook. Now." They turned back quickly, retracing their steps with urgency. The desert, moments ago quiet and sun-drenched, now felt like a stage for something ominous. As they neared the camp, Marissa waved toward an officer. "We just saw something suspicious," she panted. 3 men with a truck. One was dragging a heavy sack. They took off when they saw us." Holbrook strode toward them, concern etched across his face. "Where exactly?" David pointed. "Over the ridge to the west, not far, less than 10 minutes on foot." Holbrook turned to a nearby officer. "Radio the perimeter. We've got a potential lead. Get a unit heading west immediately. Have them scan for tire tracks, disturbed ground, anything out of place." As commands were relayed over the radio, Marissa and David stood nearby, catching their breath. Caraway approached from the tent. "What happened?" he asked, his voice low. "We saw some guys near a truck," David explained. "They ran when we called out. Looked like they were hiding something." Caraway frowned, his eyes narrowing. "This close to the site? That can't be a coincidence." "I don't think it is," Marissa agreed. "They were moving something heavy, maybe trying to get rid of it before anyone else came around." "Or returning to cover up evidence," Caraway muttered, almost to himself. Minutes later, 2 police vehicles peeled away from the scene, headed in the direction Marissa had indicated. Drones were launched, their high-pitched hum rising into the air as they scanned the terrain for movement or clues. Back under the tent, the tension among the parents had shifted. What had started as a somber but hopeful reunion was rapidly turning into something more urgent, more dangerous. If someone was still out there, someone involved in the disappearance, then everything they thought they knew could change. Susan Collins gripped Judith Lee's hand tightly. What if? What if they've been watching us? What if they know we're close? Marisa stared at the horizon, her heart pounding. For 20 years they had endured nothing but silence. Now, in less than a day, they had a suitcase, buried uniforms, and shadowy figures fleeing the scene. The waiting had ended, the chase had begun. In the final seconds before the truck disappeared from view, Marisa spotted something peculiar on the rear window. A sticker. Some sort of company logo. Her instincts flared. Without thinking, she pulled out her phone and tried to snap a photo, but the truck was already speeding off, too far for a clear shot. The resulting image was a blurry mess of red metal, dust, and an indecipherable shape. There was a logo on the back window, she said, her breath shallow from the adrenaline. Did you see it? David nodded, his face tight with worry. Yeah, but I didn't recognize it. They stood in silence, eyes fixed on the dissipating trail of dust until it vanished over the horizon. Then, driven by a mixture of dread and fierce determination, Marisa turned toward the area where the men had been gathered. Marisa, we need to get back, David warned, following behind. We're way outside the safe zone now. Just a little farther, she replied, moving quickly. I need to see what they were doing. When they reached the large cactus and scattered rocks, Marisa crouched low, scanning the earth. There, unmistakable in the sun-hardened ground, was a freshly dug hole, much like the one where the suitcase had been uncovered. David joined her, carefully surveying the disturbed soil. There's something here, he said, reaching down. His fingers closed around a small object buried beneath the sand. He brushed it clean and held it up. Marisa gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Oh my God, David! That's Amber's earring. She took the tarnished item from his palm with trembling fingers. Though dulled and corroded, the design was unmistakable. A tiny silver star with a ruby-colored gem in its center. She had bought a matching pair for the twins' 13th birthday, just months before they vanished. Are you sure? David asked, his voice hushed. Marisa nodded, eyes brimming. Positive. I picked them out myself. I had their initials engraved on the back. A mix of hope and fear surged through her chest. David, these men, they must know something. They have to. They scoured the area for more evidence, but the ground had been cleared. Whatever else had been hidden there was gone. With the earring clutched in her hand, Marisa finally turned back. We have to tell Detective Holbrook, right now. These men, this could be the break we've been praying for. Back at the investigation site, Detective Holbrook was speaking with a forensic technician. The other parents were scattered around, watching the activity or lost in quiet conversations. Marisa called out urgently as they approached. Detective, we need to speak with you. It's important. Holbrook turned, immediately noting the urgency on their faces. What happened? We found something, David said. Marisa opened her hand and revealed the small, dusty earring. This belonged to our daughter Amber. I'm sure of it, she said. I gave matching ones to the girls on their birthday. Holbrook took the earring, turning it over in his hand. Where did you find this? About half a mile west, David said. We saw 3 men near a truck. One was dragging a sack, another was digging. When they saw us, they fled. We went to the spot and found this buried. Holbrook's expression darkened. You chased after unknown men in a remote part of the desert? That was incredibly risky. We know, David admitted, but we couldn't just let them disappear without checking. Maybe they could be the ones who buried the suitcase, Marisa added. Or worse, they might be cleaning up, destroying anything left. The other parents began to gather, overhearing the conversation. Vincent Carraway stepped forward, brows furrowed. What's going on? Holbrook held up the earring. The Greens found this in the sand, where they saw 3 men acting suspiciously. Mrs. Green believes it belonged to her daughter. Carraway's eyes widened. "That does look like the earrings the girls used to wear," he said slowly, his voice somber. "Did you see their faces?" Holbrook asked, turning to David and Marissa. "Would you recognize them?" "It was too far to see clearly," David said, "but I remember the build of one guy, broad shoulders, wearing a gray hoodie, and I did notice a company logo on the back window of the truck." Holbrook immediately pulled out his notepad. "What did it look like?" "I couldn't make it out fully," Marissa said, pulling out her phone. "I tried to get a picture, but it's pretty useless." She handed him the phone. The photo was indeed blurred, the logo a faint smudge of color and shape. "Could you draw what you remember?" he asked, offering a pen and notepad. Marissa hesitated. "I'm not much of an artist, but I'll try." She concentrated, sketching slowly, her brows knit in effort. After a minute, she handed it back. It looked like a stylized bird, maybe a phoenix, with its wings spread. And underneath, 3 letters, C, P, and F. Linda Thompson leaned in. "CPF," she repeated aloud. "Does that mean anything?" "Not offhand," Holbrook said, flipping open his phone. "But we'll run it through databases, business registries, transportation logs, whatever we can find." He stepped away to make the call as the parents exchanged tense glances. Marissa sat on a nearby folding chair, clutching the earring again. David stood at her side, scanning the desert. Judith approached quietly. "Are you sure it's hers?" "Yes," Marissa said. "I even had their initials engraved. Look." She turned it over. The tiny letters AMMG were barely visible in the metal. Judith inhaled sharply. "That means they were here." Susan Collins knelt beside them, or someone who had their things here. Moments later, Holbrook returned. "No match yet on CPF, but we've flagged it. Highway Patrol and surrounding departments are on alert." "I think the truck was an older model," David added. "Dark red, maybe a Ford, no front plate. It was dusty, dented, probably off-road a lot." "We've already issued a vehicle alert with that description," Holbrook said. "Drones are sweeping the area now. We'll also review satellite and traffic cam footage." Caraway, who had remained silent, spoke again. "If they buried this recently, maybe there's more out there. Maybe they've been back more than once." "Melby could have a hideout," Susan whispered. "MI might have come back for something they left behind," Judith said. "Or to move what's still here." "We're expanding the search grid," Holbrook confirmed. "And this earring changes everything. This isn't just about a buried suitcase anymore." The forensic tech returned and sealed the earring in a labeled evidence bag. Marissa hesitated before letting it go. As the sun dipped lower, casting orange hues across the sand, the camp grew quiet. The mood had shifted, from passive investigation to high alert. Every ridge was now a threat, every gust of wind a whisper of buried truths. Susan held Judith's hand. "If they were here, if they saw us—" "They know we're getting close," David finished grimly. "They won't give up their secrets easily," Caraway added. "If they've held them this long, they won't stop now." Holbrook gathered everyone near the tent. "We're stationing units overnight. No one's leaving this site unsearched. And if these men come back, we'll be ready." Marissa turned, her eyes scanning the horizon again. Somewhere, not far from this place, answers were waiting. And now, for the first time in 20 years, she could almost reach them. The moment Linda Thompson spoke up, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife, everyone turned. "CPF, that sounds like Caraway Performance and Fitness," she said. All eyes shifted instantly to Vincent Caraway. The cheerleading coach stood still, his expression unreadable as the focus narrowed on him. Marissa's pulse quickened. Could this be the connection? Could the man they had trusted with their daughter so long ago be linked to their disappearance? "Caraway Performance and Fitness," Detective Holbrook repeated slowly, watching Caraway with sharp eyes. "That was your company?" Caraway gave a small, deliberate nod. "Yes. CPF was the business I started back in the late 80s. We specialized in athletic training, team development, and personal fitness. We were also the primary sponsor for the school's cheerleading team, but more than that, we funded much of the search operations after the girls went missing. I opened our resources, sent volunteers. I cooperated with everything. I had nothing to hide. The detective nodded, glancing at the parents. It's true. Coach Carraway's business was vetted during the initial investigation. CPF provided funding, personnel, and equipment. They were fully transparent at the time. But the logo, Marissa interjected, her voice trembling slightly. It was on the truck window. That's not a coincidence. I sold the company, Carraway said calmly but firmly. Almost exactly 20 years ago, just before the girls vanished. Detective Holbrook raised his brow. To whom? Matthew Rands, Carraway replied. He kept me on as a consultant for about a year after the sale. That's probably why my name remained tied to the group during the early search efforts. But I haven't been formally connected to CPF in nearly 2 decades. I'll need the details of that sale and Mr. Rance's contact information, Holbrook said, flipping open his notepad. Of course, Carraway answered. I'll get you everything I have. At that moment, Michael Lee, Hannah's father, who had been quietly sketching, held up a sheet of paper. Would it have looked something like this? He asked Marissa. The drawing showed a stylized bird with widespread wings encircling the letters CFP in bold type. Marissa leaned closer, her breath catching. Yes, that's almost exactly it. Carraway studied the sketch. That is very close to my old logo, but again, I haven't had any connection to the company in a long time. Even if you're no longer involved, Marissa said quietly, someone still is, and they're using that logo today. Detective Holbrook tapped his pen against his notebook. Did you see a license plate on the truck? No, David replied. We looked, but there wasn't one visible. That alone is suspicious, the detective murmured, jotting a note. Turning back to Marissa and David, Holbrook continued, Can you show us the exact spot where you encountered these men and found the earring? It's close, David confirmed. We could take you right there. I'll send a team, Holbrook said. If they fled in a rush, they may have left something behind. I want to come with you, Marissa said quickly. But Holbrook shook his head. It's too dangerous. We can't afford to risk civilians out there. You can wait at the base camp or return to town for now. David placed a hand on Marissa's arm, grounding her. We'll stay close, but we'll follow your lead. Holbrook nodded and turned to his officers to assemble a search unit. Just then, Chris Delaney approached, with Dusty at his side. I know that terrain pretty well, he offered. I could help your team navigate. I appreciate it, Mr. Delaney, Holbrook said sincerely, but we can't involve civilians at this point. Chris nodded understandingly. Just thought I'd offer. Marissa reached out to touch his arm. Thank you, truly. We wouldn't have come this far without you and Dusty. Chris smiled softly. Glad we could help. Before leaving, Marissa handed over the earring. Holbrook accepted it solemnly and sealed it in an evidence bag. We're going to find out the truth, he promised. I hope so, Marissa whispered, because after 20 years, we can't go back to not knowing. The parents were offered a ride back to the base camp, or, if they preferred, a nearby diner to rest while they waited for updates. Marissa and David chose the diner, hoping to get some air, perhaps food, but mostly space to process what had just unfolded. They pulled into a gravel lot, the diner's neon open sign buzzing in the window. The place had a small-town charm. Red vinyl booths, black and white floor tiles, and the aroma of grilled food and brewed coffee wafting through the air. Inside, it was cool and dim compared to the blinding sun outside. A few locals sat quietly at the counter, talking softly. The jukebox played a faint country ballad from a bygone decade. They slid into a booth by the window. A waitress approached with menus, her expression tired but kind. Coffee to start, she asked. Yes, please, David said. Marissa nodded silently. As the waitress walked away, Marissa leaned her head on her hand. CPF, that logo, the earring. All of this can't be a coincidence. No, David agreed. But it also doesn't mean Carraway is involved. I know, she said. It's just, after all this time, I don't know what to believe anymore. Their coffees arrived, and they sat in silence for a while, letting the warmth of the mug seep into their hands. Marissa stared out the window, her mind spiraling with questions. Then her phone buzzed. There was a text from an unknown number. Attached was the blurry photo she'd taken earlier, now digitally enhanced. The CPF logo was clearer. Underneath, a short message. Check local business licenses. Name changed in 2011. She stared at the screen, heart pounding. "David," she said, pushing the phone across the table. "Look at this." He read the message, then met her eyes. "We need to call Holbrook. Right now." Marissa nodded. "We may have just found our next lead." Back at the base camp, the atmosphere was a swirl of conflicting emotions. Relief, confusion, suspicion. Parents clustered in quiet circles, exchanging theories with nervous glances. The discovery of the CPF logo had shifted the tone of the entire day. What once seemed like a long, cold case now pulsed with the possibility of fresh clues, and with them a resurgence of buried fears. Detective Holbrook was already on his phone, speaking with dispatch and reviewing company registry databases. He wanted every variant of CPF or Caraway Performance and Fitness that had appeared in local records in the past 20 years. If the logo was still in use, someone had to be maintaining it. The thought that this clue had eluded them for so long both infuriated and invigorated him. Meanwhile, Marissa sat in the diner, her coffee growing cold as she stared blankly at the table. Every nerve in her body was firing with possibilities. Was the text she'd received a prank, a mistake? Or had someone out there been watching the case unfold from the shadows? Someone who finally wanted the truth to surface? David tapped his fingers against the table. "Who would have this number?" he asked. "That message didn't come from the police or media. Someone went out of their way to get it to you." "Maybe they couldn't come forward directly," Marissa said. "Maybe they were scared." She paused, then added, "Or maybe it's someone from inside CPF who's finally ready to talk." They exchanged a look, equal parts dread and hope. "Let's call Holbrook," David said. "He needs to know about this, now." And David chose a booth in the back corner where they could talk privately while keeping an eye on the door. A middle-aged waitress approached with a pot of coffee and 2 menus. "Afternoon, folks," she greeted warmly. "Coffee while you decide?" "Please," David replied, turning his cup right side up. After she poured the coffee and took their orders, a club sandwich for David and a bowl of soup for Marissa, they sat quietly, each absorbed in thought. The weight of the day pressed down on them. "I can't believe we found Ember's earring," Marissa said at last, her voice low. "After all this time, it can't be a coincidence." David cradled his mug, the warmth doing little to settle his nerves. "I know. But we have to let the police handle it, Marissa. These men could be dangerous." Marissa leaned forward, her gaze sharp. "And what if the police don't find them? What if those men know where our daughters are and we lose our chance to find them again? We should go back and follow their trail ourselves." "That's crazy," David whispered, trying to keep his tone calm. "The police have resources we don't. Holbrook knows what he's doing." "Does he?" she shot back, bitterness creeping in. "It's been 20 years, David. 20 years of nothing. A hiker with a dog found that suitcase, not the police. And it wasn't even buried that deep. What does that say about how hard they've looked?" David reached across the table and took her hand. "I understand your frustration, believe me, but rushing into the desert on our own won't help April and Amber. It could make things worse." Just then the waitress returned with their plates. "Here you go. Can I get you anything else?" "No, thank you," David replied, managing a polite smile. As she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, Marissa froze. A glint of silver on the waitress's earlobe caught her eye, a tiny star with a red gem at the center. Her breath caught. "Excuse me," she said, voice strained. "That earring you're wearing, may I ask where you got it?" The waitress blinked, touching the jewelry self-consciously. "This old thing? A customer gave it to me years ago. Said it matched my eyes. It's missing its pair, though. He said the other got lost somewhere, but he let me keep one." David followed Marissa's gaze, his expression shifting as recognition dawned. "Was the customer a local?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "Not sure if he lives around here, but he stops in now and then, real polite. Good tipper." She pointed toward a corkboard on the wall. "He's on our customer wall somewhere." "Thank you," Marissa said, barely masking her urgency. "It's a beautiful earring." The waitress nodded and moved to another table. Marissa and David turned toward the photo wall. Dozens of pictures, snapshots of happy diners and regulars, locals celebrating anniversaries, travelers stopping in for meals, and truckers posing with staff. Somewhere in that collage might be the man they saw in the desert. "Do you see anyone familiar?" David whispered. Marissa scanned the faces. "Not yet. There are so many." Suddenly, her phone rang. She jumped, fumbling for it. The number was unfamiliar. Stepping away from the booth, she answered. "Hello? Mrs. Green, this is Officer Mendes with Detective Holbrook's team." "Yes, officer. Did you find something?" "We tracked the tire marks to an abandoned shack about 5 miles from where you spotted the men. The truck was there, but it was empty, and the suspects were gone. No sign of them at all." "None. We searched the shack and the surrounding area thoroughly. The vehicle was abandoned, no sack, no tools, nothing. But it's been impounded, and we're processing it for evidence." "Thank you," she said quietly. "Please keep us updated." When she returned to the booth, David was waiting anxiously. "Manny found the truck," she told him, sliding into her seat. "Abandoned near a shack. No sign of the men." "At least they have the vehicle," David said. "Maybe they'll find fingerprints or something." Marissa nodded, but her mind was elsewhere, on the waitress's earring and the man who had given it to her. The connection was too strong to ignore. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were closer to something than they had ever been. Marissa leaned across the table. "That earring. It's not just similar. It's hers. I'd recognize it anywhere." David didn't argue. "You think the man who gave it to her is one of the men from the desert?" "She said he's been coming here for years. And she said he's on the photo wall." They rose and returned to the wall, studying the images more closely now. Marissa focused on every detail, the shape of a nose, the line of a jaw, and posture. Then she spotted someone. "Here," she said, pointing to a man in a flannel shirt with a faint scar on his temple. "He looks familiar." David studied the photo. "It might be. We need more." They returned to their booth just as the waitress brought their check. "Sorry to ask again," Marissa began, "but do you remember what kind of truck that man drives?" She nodded. "Maroon pickup, with a white stripe down the side. Always parks in the back lot." "Do you have cameras facing the lot?" She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. "Yes, don't tell my boss I told you, but we've got a camera out there. The manager downloads the footage every few days." Marissa's heart raced. "Could we see it?" "I'll ask him. Hold on." Minutes later, the waitress returned, a little pale. "He was here last Thursday. Came in around 11:45 a.m., ordered a BLT, iced tea, parked in the back, same truck." "Is the footage still saved?" "I think so. You'll need to ask my manager. The office is through that door." They found the manager, a tall, broad man with a skeptical gaze that softened as Marissa explained the situation. After some hesitation, he agreed to pull up the security footage. On screen, the maroon pickup rolled into view. The driver exited, a tall man wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses. Hard to see clearly, but the body language, the build, it matched what they remembered. Then the camera caught the rear window. Sepia, clear as day. And beneath it, a license plate. Marissa stared, her hand clamped over her mouth. "David, we need to call Holbrook, right now." David was picking at his sandwich, but Marissa couldn't touch her soup. The idea that this woman, so close, so ordinary, might unknowingly hold a key to their daughter's fate was overwhelming. When the waitress returned with the coffee pot, Marissa made a decision. "I need to talk to you about something," she said, her voice low and urgent. "It might sound strange, but please hear me out." The waitress, curious but not alarmed, paused with the pot in hand. "Is something wrong with your food?" "No, nothing like that," Marissa assured her, glancing briefly at David. He shot her a wary look, but Marissa pressed on. "It's about your earring." The waitress tilted her head, confused. Marissa took a deep breath. "This morning I found the matching pair to your earring in the desert," she explained, watching the woman's face carefully. "It belonged to my daughter, Amber. She disappeared 20 years ago, along with 5 other girls from their cheerleading team." The waitress's hand went to her earlobe, instinctively brushing the silver star. Her eyes widened. "I don't understand." The police found the cheerleading uniforms buried out there, David added gently. Then Marissa found our daughter's earring at a nearby site. Some men were digging there. When they saw us, they ran. The waitress stared at them, frozen, her face suddenly pale. You think this earring has something to do with your daughter? I know it sounds unbelievable, Marissa said, keeping her tone measured. But those earrings were custom. I gave them to my daughters for their 13th birthday. The odds of you having the identical one by pure chance, it's nearly impossible. The waitress sat heavily in the empty seat beside David, her shock evident. The man who gave it to me, I had no idea. She paused, her brow furrowing in concentration. Do you remember who he was? David asked, his voice soft. She nodded slowly. Not his name exactly, but I've seen him here a few times over the years. Less lately. He's a friend of Gerald Laffinger. He lives out on a ranch about 10 miles from here. Gerald Laffinger? Marissa repeated, locking the name in her memory. He's a catering customer, the waitress continued. We deliver meals to his ranch every day. Actually, she checked her watch. I'm due to drop off today's order in about 20 minutes. Marissa and David exchanged a glance, the moment crackling with silent urgency. I don't know if I can trust you, the waitress said quietly. Giving out customer info could get me fired. Jobs aren't easy to come by out here. We understand, Marissa said, her tone sincere. But if these men have answers about what happened to our daughters, wouldn't you want to help? The waitress seemed torn, her lips pressed into a thin line. Then, with a breath, she made her choice. Look, I can't give you an address, but if you happen to follow me, I can't control who drives on public roads, can I? Relief flooded Marissa's chest. Thank you. You have no idea what this means to us. Just promise me something, the waitress said, rising to her feet. If anything happens, don't mention me. This job is all I've got. We promise, David said solemnly. She nodded and disappeared into the kitchen. Marissa and David quickly settled the bill and stepped outside. As they made their way to the car, David spotted a familiar figure across the street. Chris Delaney, the hiker, was filling his gas tank while Dusty lounged in the passenger seat. But before they could approach him, the diner's side door opened, and the waitress emerged, now in a delivery apron and loading several large insulated bags onto the back of a small motorcycle. She caught Marissa's eye briefly, then looked away. Let's go, Marissa said, sliding into the passenger seat. David started the engine and waited until the waitress turned out of the parking lot. They followed at a discreet distance, the desert stretching ahead under the afternoon sun. 15 minutes passed in tense silence. The waitress turned onto a dirt road marked by a weathered wooden sign, Laughing Ranch, private property. David continued driving until they were safely out of view, then pulled off to the side. Now what? He asked. We wait until she leaves. Then we go to the gate, asked to speak with Gerald Laffinger, about his friend, the man who gave her Amber's earring. But that's risky, Marissa, David said. We shouldn't confront them directly. We observe, we tell Holbrook, let him handle it. Marissa considered it. Maybe you're right. At least we know where this place is now. We can pass that to the police. They reversed and parked on a low rise that offered a clear view of the entrance without being too obvious. The property was bordered by a tall iron fence. Security cameras were mounted on the posts beside a wide, automated gate. Beyond it, several buildings dotted the land. A large main house, 2 smaller structures, and what appeared to be a stable or barn. Everything was immaculately maintained. The waitress parked her motorcycle just inside the gate and handed the delivery to a uniformed guard. The catering containers were bulky, far more than one man would need. What kind of ranch needs enough food for 20 people delivered every day? David asked. Maybe he employs a lot of ranch hands, Marissa offered, but even she didn't sound convinced. Her instincts screamed that something unusual was happening here. They watched as the guard signed off on the order and waved the waitress through. A few minutes later, she emerged with empty containers, climbed onto her bike, and exited the property. She's leaving, Marissa noted. Should we get a closer look? David was about to answer when they spotted a truck approaching the gate from inside the property. It stopped momentarily. The same guard who'd accepted the food returned, this time speaking with the driver. Marissa grabbed the binoculars and focused in. The driver wore sunglasses and a baseball cap, but his body language, the slope of his shoulders, it felt familiar. "That could be one of the men from the desert," she whispered. David took the binoculars. "Could be. He's built the same casual way of moving." "Let's not get too close," Marissa said. "We can't risk alerting them." David nodded. "We have names now, a location, and a pattern." Marissa watched the gate as it closed behind the truck. Her stomach twisted. "Let's go call Holbrook." They watched as the waitress disappeared down the dirt road in a rising cloud of dust. The motorcycle's growl faded until only the desert wind remained. "Should we call Detective Holbrook?" David asked, his hand hovering over his phone. Marissa considered it, her eyes still on the gate. "We don't have any concrete evidence. Just a chain of coincidences. I'm not sure he'd drop everything based on that." As they debated, the iron gate creaked open. A blue Jeep rolled out, dust swirling behind its heavy tires. Inside were 3 men. Marissa tensed, eyes narrowing. She recognized them instantly. The same men they'd seen in the desert near the buried cheerleading uniforms. "That's them," she hissed, ducking below the dashboard. "Those are the guys." David tensed. The Jeep rolled slowly past them, seemingly uninterested, but as the 2 vehicles met, one of the men in the back turned his head. Marissa's gaze locked with his for a fleeting second. Cold recognition passed between them. "They saw us," she whispered, heart pounding. "We need to go, now." David started the engine and accelerated onto the road, heading away from the ranch. In the rearview mirror, he watched as the Jeep slowed. Then it made a sharp U-turn. "They're coming after us," David said, his voice tight. Marissa twisted in her seat. "Drive faster." David pressed the pedal, but the Jeep was built for rough terrain. It was faster, more agile. Within minutes it had closed the distance. With a sudden swerve, the Jeep cut them off, forcing David to slam on the brakes. The Jeep's doors flew open. The 3 men stepped out in unison. Behind them, 2 more vehicles surged from the ranch gates, closing in fast. "David?" Marissa whispered, her voice trembling. "What do we do?" But there was no time for strategy. The men surrounded their car. One approached the driver's side, his hand resting near his belt. "Get out of the car," he ordered. David raised his hands and nodded. He and Marissa stepped out slowly into the stifling desert heat. Their hearts thundered with fear. "Who are you and why are you watching the ranch?" another man demanded. Marissa squared her shoulders, summoning every ounce of courage. "My name is Marissa Green. This is my husband David. We're looking for our daughters. They disappeared 20 years ago. We have reason to believe someone here may know something." The men exchanged uncertain glances. Then one of them brought a radio to his mouth. "We have the couple from the desert. They're claiming to be looking for missing daughters, awaiting instructions." Static crackled. Then a voice responded, "Bring them in." With no other choice, Marissa and David were ushered into one of the arriving vehicles and driven through the gate. The metal bars closed behind them with a heavy finality. Inside Lavender Ranch, the view changed drastically. The interior grounds were pristine. Manicured lawns, perfectly trimmed hedges, vibrant flower beds. It looked like a resort rather than a ranch. Peaceful, orderly, but Marissa felt only dread. They were led into the main house, not through the front but through a side entrance. The hallway was lined with Western-themed artwork, polished wood floors, and faint music drifting from unseen speakers. The men escorted them to a study. Bookshelves lined the walls, and a massive desk stood at its center. Large windows framed the horizon, painting a serene contrast to their fear. "Wait here," one of the men instructed. Before leaving, they searched them thoroughly. Phones, wallets, car keys, everything confiscated. Then the door clicked shut, leaving them alone. David tested the handle. "It's locked. We're trapped." Marissa was already scanning the room for anything useful. "We should have called Holbrook," David muttered. "It's too late for that now," she replied. She tried the desk drawers. Locked. No weapons, no phone, nothing useful. David paced. If these guys were involved in the girl's disappearance, why didn't they just do something to us in the desert? Why bring us here? Marissa shook her head. "Maybe they want to know what we know. Maybe there's more to this." Their conversation stopped as heavy footsteps approached. The door opened. A man stepped inside, older, stocky, dressed in an expensive tailored suit despite the heat. His silver hair was perfectly styled and a gold watch gleamed on his wrist. Authority radiated from him. "Mr. and Mrs. Green," he said smoothly. "I'm Gerald Loffinger. I understand you've been asking about me." Marissa stepped forward. "Please, have you seen our daughters? We just want to know what happened." Loffinger raised an eyebrow, more amused than alarmed. "Straight to the point. I respect that. But I'm curious. What brings an aging couple to my property? My men say they saw you spying on us in the desert." David stepped in. "We found a cheerleading uniform buried in the sand. It matched what our daughters were wearing the night they disappeared. Near that, we found an earring, identical to one my daughter Amber owned." Loffinger said nothing for a moment. Then he walked slowly around the desk and sat down. He steepled his fingers, regarding them intently. "So you think my ranch, my people are connected to an incident from 2 decades ago?" "We don't know what to think," Marissa said, "but someone gave that earring to a waitress at the diner. She says he's a friend of yours." Loffinger's expression shifted, just a fraction. "You're referring to Matthew Rands, I presume?" "Yes," Marissa said. "Do you know where we can find him?" Loffinger leaned back in his chair. "He was a business partner. We ran some property investments together in the late 90s. He handled logistics, but I haven't heard from him in years." "Could you give us a way to contact him?" David asked. "I might have an address, an old one. But let me be very clear. You two are lucky. My men didn't know who you were. I don't appreciate strangers observing my estate." "We're desperate," Marissa said softly. "Any parent would be." Loffinger paused, then nodded slowly. He pressed a button on his desk. A moment later the door opened, and a guard entered. "Return their belongings. Escort them to their car. I'll find that address and have someone deliver it." The guard nodded. Loffinger stood and faced them one last time. "I hope you find what you're looking for," he said, though his tone betrayed nothing, no warmth, no threat, just practiced civility. As the guard led them away, Marissa's heart pounded. They were finally inside the world they had been chasing for 20 years, but whether it held answers or danger was still unknown. Marissa's voice was firm, her words steady despite the terror gripping her chest. "The earring our friend saw," Embers, "was given to a waitress at a diner, and we saw a truck with a CPF logo on it, Caraway Performance and Fitness, the company that used to sponsor our daughter's cheerleading team." Loffinger's mask of calm didn't falter, but something in his gaze flickered. A recognition, perhaps, or a sudden fatigue that betrayed hidden knowledge. "You've been busy," he said at last, tone unreadable. "But I'm afraid you've stumbled into something far more complex than you understand." "Then explain it to us," Marissa pressed, taking a step forward. "Tell us what happened to our daughters." Loffinger stood slowly, moving to the edge of his polished desk. His hands were clasped in front of him as he studied them with clinical interest. "Information, Mrs. Green, carries a very high price, and I'm not certain I'm the one authorized to offer it." "What kind of price?" Marissa asked, desperation seeping into her voice. "We'll pay anything. Just tell us where April and Amber are." A cold smile crept across Loffinger's face. "It's not about money. But since you've come this far and clearly learned too much already, I no longer have the luxury of indecision." He moved to the door and opened it with a flourish. The 3 men they had encountered in the desert stood there, silent and stone-faced. "Take them to special accommodations," Loffinger ordered, his voice now devoid of charm. "If they're so desperate to find the women, let them see them up close. Make sure they're comfortable. They'll be with us for quite some time." One of the men hesitated. "Sir, are you sure?" "Yes," he said coldly. "Let the old dancing man decide what to do with them." "You can't do this," David shouted as the men entered, gripping his and Marissa's arms with calculated force. "People will look for us. The police know we were following a lead." The laughter laughed then, the sound sharp and humorless. "The police?" he scoffed. "Don't worry about them. It's easy to stage an accident in the desert. Car goes off the road, gas tank ruptures. Very tragic. No one will come looking for you here." Despite their resistance, Marissa and David were dragged from the office, through the well-groomed grounds, and toward a large barn. It looked ordinary at first glance, horse stalls, hay bales, and farm tools. But at the far end, a door that appeared to be a supply closet was opened, revealing a staircase descending into darkness. "Move!" one of the men barked, giving David a rough shove. They descended into a damp, chilled corridor. The further they went, the more oppressive the air became. At the bottom was a metal door with an advanced keypad. One of the guards punched in a code and the door opened with a mechanical hiss. The space beyond could only be described as a bunker. Harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, revealing concrete floors, a sparse kitchenette, a row of military cots, and a single grimy bathroom enclosed by partial walls. But it wasn't the bleakness that stole Marissa's breath. 3 women sat on cots near the back, all appearing in their early 30s, the same age April and Amber would be now. Their eyes were hollow, their skin pale from lack of sunlight, their expressions etched with guarded fear. Yet they were clean and clothed, suggesting they had not been physically neglected. The men forced Marissa and David to their knees and bound their wrists to a thick pipe running from floor to ceiling in the center of the room. Without a word, they exited, locking the metal door behind them. The click of the bolts echoed like thunder in the still room. Silence stretched thin as Marissa and David processed the situation. Then, one of the women stood. Her voice was hesitant. "Who are you?" Before they could answer, footsteps approached from above. The door opened again, and Gerald Lockhunger stepped inside, surveying the scene with quiet satisfaction. "This," he said, gesturing around him, "is the cost of curiosity. Now you'll have the rest of your lives to learn the truth, right here with the survivors." "Survivors?" David echoed, his voice cracking. Lakinger ignored him, turning to the women. "Ladies, meet your new roommates. I'm sure you'll have plenty to discuss." As he turned to leave, he paused at the threshold. "And don't get any ideas about helping them escape. You remember what happened last time someone tried that, don't you?" The woman flinched. One looked away, blinking back tears. Then Loffinger was gone, the locks clicking shut behind him. From above, they could hear his voice rising in anger. "That damn dancing man," he growled. "Get me Matthew and Caraway on the line, and pray to God Caraway hasn't started talking to the cops to save his own ass." The name hit Marissa like a bolt of lightning. Vincent Caraway, the cheerleading coach. He was involved. Once the echoes faded, Marissa turned back to the women. Her voice trembled with urgency. "Please, help us. We're looking for April and Amber Green, our daughters. They disappeared 20 years ago." The 3 women exchanged looks. One of them, a tall woman with short-cropped hair, stood and approached slowly. She turned her back, lifting the hem of her shirt just slightly. Beneath, a lattice of scars marred her skin. Thin, pale lines crisscrossed like a terrible road map, evidence of beatings, torture. "This," she said quietly, "is what happens when we break the rules. If we help you, they'll do worse." Marissa's breath caught. Her eyes welled with tears. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I can't imagine what you've endured, but please, if there's even a chance, you know where our daughters are." The woman looked back at her. "We heard names, April and Amber. Years ago. There were more girls back then. 12 total, maybe more. Most of them were moved. Some disappeared. We stayed." "Why?" David asked hoarsely. "Why keep some and not others?" "Obedience," she replied. "We followed the rules. Others didn't." Marissa leaned forward, straining against the ropes. "Do you know if they're alive?" A pause. Then, "We don't know, but there's someone who might. They call him the archivist. He keeps records, files. He works upstairs." David's eyes widened. "Where?" "He lives in the far wing of the main house. We only see him when someone is taken or punished, but he knows everything." Hope flared in Marissa's chest. "Can you get us to him?" The woman shook her head slowly. "Not now, but tonight, during lights out, we might have a chance." Across the room, one of the other women, a redhead with eyes like chipped glass, spoke for the first time. If you get a chance to escape, don't look back. Whatever you do, don't try to save us. You can't save everyone, but if you can get out, you can bring the police, you can bring the truth." Marissa's throat tightened. She could see the hope smoldering behind the woman's warning, the cautious belief that maybe, just maybe, these two strangers could be the key to salvation. She looked at David. He was battered but still holding on to resolve. They had survived this long, and they wouldn't stop now. They would fight. For April. For Amber. For all the girls who never came home. Somewhere in the shadows above them, a reckoning was waiting. They disappeared 20 years ago with their cheerleading squad. Do you know them? The woman froze, her eyes widening in apparent recognition. She turned slowly to face Marissa, studying her features closely. "Mom," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Dad?" Marissa's heart seemed to stop. "April? Amber?" she breathed, her voice cracking. The woman swallowed hard. "I'm April," she confirmed, tears filling her eyes. David made a choke sound beside Marissa, straining against his bonds. "April," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "Oh my God, we found you!" April hesitated, then knelt down and began working at the knots that bound their hands, her movements quick but cautious. "We can't make noise," she warned in a whisper. "They monitor this room sometimes." As she worked, Marissa drank in the sight of her daughter. A woman now, her face showing the strain of whatever horror she had endured, but still recognizably the child they had lost. "What happened to you?" she asked, tears streaming down her face. "Where's Amber?" April paused, pain flashing across her features. "Only 3 of us survived," she said softly. "Me, Kira Thompson, and Hannah Lee." She nodded toward the other 2 women who watched the reunion with a mixture of hope and caution. "Rachel died from complications of a sexually transmitted infection a few years ago. They wouldn't get her proper medical care." Marissa closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the horror of what her daughter was telling her. "And Amber?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. April's hands trembled as she continued working on the knots. "Amber and Lily were killed for trying to organize an escape with the rest of us. That was the last time any of us tried to get away. They made us watch to teach us a lesson." A sob escaped Marissa's throat, the pain of knowing her other daughter had been murdered nearly unbearable. David was weeping openly beside her, his shoulders shaking with grief. "I'm so sorry," April whispered, finally freeing Marissa's hands. "I never thought I'd see you again. What are you doing here? How did you find us?" As April moved to untie David, Marissa explained about the suitcase found in the desert, the earring, and how they had followed the waitress to the ranch. "The police know we were following a lead," she assured her daughter. "They'll come looking for us when we don't return." April shook her head, her expression bleak. "Mom, if they're as good at covering their tracks as they have been for 20 years, no one will find us here. This bunker is soundproofed. We've screamed and shouted for help 1,000 times. No one ever hears." David, now free, pulled April into a tight embrace. "We're not giving up," he promised. "We'll find a way out of here." Kira and Hannah approached cautiously, introduced themselves, and Marissa hugged them both, thinking of their parents who had waited so long for answers. "Your parents never stopped looking for you," she told them. "None of us did." "Who did this to you?" David asked, his grief transforming into anger. "Who took you?" Kira spoke up, her voice stronger than April's. "It was Coach Caraway. He and his men drugged us after the competition and brought us here. Laffinger owns this place, but Caraway is the one who uses us." "And there's another man," Hannah added, "Matthew Rands. He handles the logistics for Caraway's company. Everyone thinks he's the owner, but it's really still Laffinger behind everything. They just use Matthew as a front." Marissa remembered what Detective Holbrook had said about Caraway selling his company 20 years ago. So, Caraway lied about selling the company, she realized. He just put it in Matthew's name to distance himself from it in case anyone got suspicious. April nodded. "Caraway visits once a month, but otherwise, we just stay down here. No one is allowed to touch us except him, not even Lofkinger or Matthew. We're his special girls, he says." The horror of their situation was overwhelming. As hours passed by, Just as they began to gather the courage to talk about escape, distant noises echoed from above. Shouting, and what sounded like gunshots. April rushed to help David find something they could use to signal their presence, settling on a metal food tray that he began banging against the pipe they had been tied to. The noise was deafening in the confined space, and they took turns banging rhythmically and shouting for help. Despite April's insistence that the bunker was soundproof, they had to try. Minutes that felt like hours passed, and the gunfire above eventually fell silent. Then, miraculously, they heard movement on the stairs, followed by voices calling out, "Police, is anyone down there?" Hope surged through Marissa as they all shouted back, directing the rescuers to the locked door. After several tense moments, the electronic lock disengaged and the door swung open to reveal several police officers in tactical gear, weapons drawn. One of them held up an electronic car key, likely taken from the men who had captured them. "We need medical assistance," one officer called into his radio as they assessed the situation. "We have 5 civilians, appear to be the missing persons, and 2 others." As they were led up the stairs and out of the barn, Marissa held tightly to April's hand, afraid that if she let go, her daughter might disappear again. Outside, the ranch was swarming with police vehicles and ambulances. Several bodies lay on the ground covered with sheets, men who had resisted arrest and been shot by police near the main house. As the officers guided them away from the barn, the full extent of the raid became clearer. Searchlights swept across the property. Officers were combing the stables, the guest houses, and even the fields beyond the fenced perimeter. Helicopters hovered overhead, their rotors churning the air as floodlights cut through the darkness. A small tent had been set up by the EMTs, where survivors and officers alike were receiving medical assessments. Marissa and David were immediately seated and wrapped in blankets, paramedics checking their vitals. April, Kira, and Hannah sat nearby, each looking dazed and overwhelmed, but finally safe. For the first time in 2 decades, the weight of captivity began to lift from their shoulders. It was surreal, almost impossible to believe. Detective Holbrook appeared moments later, his face lined with concern. When he saw Marissa and David, he hurried over and crouched beside them. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough with urgency. Marissa nodded, tears streaming freely now. "You found us. You actually found us." "We followed your GPS signal and traced it to the ranch. When the waitress came back to town alone, we questioned her. She finally gave up the address," Holbrook explained. "I'm so sorry it took this long." April reached out, gripping the detective's hand tightly. "There are records in the office, files, photos, everything. If you find them, you'll see what they did to us." Holbrook nodded. "We'll search every inch of this place. No one's walking away from this." As the survivors were loaded into ambulances bound for the hospital, officers escorted Laffinger, Caraway, and Matthew Rance, now in handcuffs, out of the main house. Their faces were a mix of fury and defeat. Laffinger snarled something unintelligible as he passed Marissa, but she met his gaze with steely resolve. "You'll rot for what you did," she said, her voice like ice. And this time, she knew it was true. In the distance, dawn was beginning to break, casting soft light over the ranch. For Marissa, it was the first morning in 20 years that held the promise of healing. There was still so much to reckon with, so many wounds that would take time to mend, but for the first time in decades, there was hope. Marissa spotted Detective Holbrook coordinating the operation. Beside him stood Chris Delaney and the waitress from the diner, both looking visibly relieved at the sight of Marissa and David emerging from the barn, dusty and disoriented, but alive. Several police cruisers lined the driveway, their doors open, flashing lights bathing the property in pulses of red and blue. Gerald Laffinger and the 3 men they had seen in the desert were being loaded into separate cruisers, handcuffed, subdued, and under heavy guard. "Detective!" Marissa called out, her voice breaking with emotion as she clutched April's hand tightly. "We found them. We found our daughter April, and Kira and Hannah too. But the others didn't make it." Detective Holbrook turned swiftly, his expression shifting from concentration to stunned relief. He crossed the yard in hurried steps, his eyes scanning April, Kira, and Hannah as if trying to reconcile their presence with 20 years of missing persons reports. "Mrs. Green, Mr. Green, Are you all right? We've been looking for you since the hiker and the waitress reported you missing. It's Carraway, David said firmly. Vincent Carraway. He's the one behind all of this. He took the girls 20 years ago. He's been holding them prisoner all this time at this ranch. The detective's face darkened, his jaw tightening. We just interviewed Carraway this morning at the station. He seemed cooperative, even provided background on the old company. But this... He turned to a nearby officer. Radio all units, priority 1. Locate and apprehend Vincent Carraway. Consider him dangerous. Lock down every exit from the county and dispatch to his residence. As paramedics began assessing everyone for injuries, Marissa struggled to process her emotions. She held April close, kissed her forehead repeatedly, and wept. Tears of relief mingled with devastating sorrow for Amber. Her little girl was gone, but April was here, and now there might finally be justice. The police station in Chandler was alive with urgency. Officers moved briskly through hallways. The press gathered outside, their vans and equipment turning the entrance into a media circus. Inside, the survivors were granted privacy in adjoining interview rooms. Marissa, David, and April refused to be separated, even for a moment. They sat huddled in a small room, each clutching the other like a lifeline. Across the hallway, Kira and Hannah were giving their statements under the care of victim advocates. Their faces pale but determined, they too wanted the truth exposed. Detective Holbrook entered the room where the Greens sat, carrying a tray with cups of water and a box of tissues. He set them down gently on the table and pulled up a chair, his eyes rimmed with fatigue but sharp with resolve. We've got roadblocks up on all major routes, he told them. Carraway won't get far. He already fled? David asked. Holbrook nodded grimly. Officers arrived at his house shortly after our interview. It was empty, closets cleared out. He must have slipped away right after leaving here, but we'll find him. He turned his attention to April. April, I know this is unimaginably difficult, but to ensure he's brought to justice, we need to understand everything. What happened then, and what's happened since. Are you ready? April took a long breath, her face steeled with purpose. Yes. I want to tell you everything. I want him caught. I want him punished for what he did to me, to my sister, to all of us. Detective Holbrook nodded and activated a recorder. For the record, could you state your full name? April Michelle Green, she replied. I was abducted on May 17, 1995, along with my twin sister Amber and 4 other girls from our cheerleading team. Can you tell us what happened that night? He prompted gently. April glanced at her parents, who squeezed her hands in support. She nodded slowly. We had just finished competing in a regional championship. We placed second. Everyone was celebrating, changing in the locker room. Coach Carraway asked Rachel to stay behind for a talk about her performance. Her voice caught. The rest of us went to a convenience store nearby to grab sodas. When we came back, we heard crying. We walked in and saw Coach touching Rachel. She was terrified, trying to push him away. He said she was special, his sole wife. Detective Holbrook leaned forward. What happened next? Lily Rivera said we had to report him to the school or our parents. Coach tried to laugh it off, but he was angry. He left the room and came back with 3 men, the same men from the ranch. They had syringes. They injected us. That's the last thing I remember. She looked away, tears spilling over. When I woke up, we were in the bunker. The room fell silent. He said we belonged to him now, April continued. That the outside world didn't want us. That our parents had forgotten us. She described in harrowing detail how the girls were isolated, how Carraway visited once a month to abuse them. Laffinger and a man named Matthew Rance kept the place running. The girls were given food, clothing, and basic supplies, but were never allowed above ground. Any disobedience was met with cruel punishment. The scars on their backs told the story better than words could. April paused, her voice trembling, and looked at the detective. Every birthday, every holiday, we imagined what our parents were doing. We prayed someone would find us, even just stumble onto the ranch. but the desert kept its secrets too well. David tightened his hold on her hand. "We never stopped looking," he said, his voice thick with grief. "We tried everything. TV interviews, searches, flyers." April nodded. "We knew. Sometimes we were allowed to watch TV, only under strict supervision, and only for short periods. Once, years ago, we saw Mom on the news. She was talking about the search. I cried for days afterward." Marissa couldn't hold back a sob. "All this time, and you were still here." The room fell silent as each of them wrestled with the magnitude of what had happened. Detective Holbrook eventually broke the silence. "What changed recently?" he asked. "Why did we suddenly find evidence now, after all these years?" "I think one of them got sloppy," April said. "Maybe they were clearing things out, moving evidence before shutting this place down. The suitcase, the digging we saw earlier, that wasn't routine. They were scared you were getting close." She looked at Marissa, her gaze fierce. "You did this. You brought the storm to their doorstep." Detective Holbrook turned to one of the officers waiting outside the room. "We'll need forensic teams on site for at least a week. There's no telling how much evidence is buried out there." Then he turned back to the family. "We'll get justice. This time, no one's getting away with it." A long silence followed, filled only with quiet breathing and the ticking of the wall clock. But underneath that silence was something else. The beginning of healing. "Rachel got sick about 5 years ago," April continued, her voice hollow and distant, her eyes staring at something far away that no one else in the room could see. "She started running fevers. We think she had some kind of infection, maybe from untreated injuries or just from the years of neglect down there. We begged them to take her to a doctor, all of us, over and over again. But they wouldn't." She paused, her hands fidgeting in her lap, knuckles white from the tension. "They gave her some antibiotics, just whatever they had lying around. It wasn't enough. Her condition got worse, sores, chills. She could barely eat. She died right there in that bunker, curled up in the corner. She never got to see her family again." Marissa wiped tears from her cheeks, picturing Susan Collins, the sweet woman who had brought snacks to every cheer practice and spent years organizing candlelight vigils after the girls disappeared. Susan would never get to hug her daughter again. Rachel had died in that dark underground prison while the world moved on above her. "And Amber?" Detective Holbrook asked softly. His voice had lost its usual firmness, as if he were walking through fragile ground with every word. "What happened to her and Lily?" April inhaled sharply, trying to steady herself. "About 3 years ago," she said, "we planned an escape." Her hands began to tremble again. Amber had managed to grab a key card from one of the guards. He'd dropped it while locking the supply room. She saw it fall and slipped it into her shoe before he noticed. "We waited for days until the timing was right. One night, when everyone was asleep upstairs, we made our move." David gently placed his arm around her shoulders, anchoring her to the moment. "We got the door open and made it through the barn, but we didn't realize there were motion detectors. The alarm went off. Guards came from everywhere. Amber and Lily were ahead. They were caught first." Her voice cracked, and she shook her head, tears spilling freely down her face now. "Caraway was furious. He screamed that we had betrayed him, that we had broken the sacred bond of trust. He said we had to be punished, all of us, and then he made us watch." Marissa could barely breathe as April choked out the words. "He strangled them, right there in front of us, said if we ever tried to escape again, we'd meet the same fate." She turned her face away, sobs racking her thin frame. David's jaw was tight, his eyes burning with tears. The pain of losing Amber again, this time forever, was unbearable. Detective Holbrook's expression was grim. He kept writing, but it looked like each word wounded him. "And the ranch? What else was it used for besides keeping you imprisoned?" April wiped her eyes. "Money laundering, we think. We overheard conversations between Laffinger and Matthew Rands. They talked about shipments, drop-offs, and routes. I think they were using the fitness company and the catering operation as a front for drug trafficking." "That would explain the catering deliveries," David murmured. "More than just food. Those deliveries were masking something else." Holbrook nodded. The FBI's on its way. This crosses state lines and touches on human trafficking and drug operations. They'll bring everything they've got. He looked back at April. Do you know how one of your earrings ended up at the diner? April nodded slowly. When Amber was killed, Matthew Rans took the earrings. He thought they were pretty. Later, I overheard him say he gave one to that cute waitress at the diner as a gift, a trophy. He kept the other one for himself. And the cheerleading uniforms? The detective asked. Why bury them now, after all this time? There was an argument, April explained. Caraway said it was getting too risky. The girls' photos were still out there, and now the internet made it easier for people to investigate. He told Laffinger to get rid of anything that could connect them to us, so they buried the uniforms. But they rushed it. They thought the desert could hide anything. More questions followed, more details spilled out. Stories of control, manipulation, and fear. Of years spent underground, locked away from the world, of broken promises and shattered spirits. When the interview finally ended, the sun had long since set, and the station glowed with harsh fluorescent lights. Detective Holbrook looked exhausted but determined. We'll need more statements in the coming days, he said, and the FBI will want to talk to all of you, but for tonight, we're getting you to the hospital. What happens after that? Marissa asked, holding April's hand tightly. You'll be placed in protective housing for now, Holbrook explained. There's already press outside. We need to manage this carefully for your safety. Just then, another officer knocked and entered with urgency, whispering something into Holbrook's ear. The detective's face shifted from fatigue to grim satisfaction. We got him, he said. Highway Patrol intercepted Caraway trying to cross into New Mexico. He's in custody. They're bringing him back to Chandler tonight. Marissa nearly collapsed with relief. The monster who had tormented her daughter for 2 decades was finally caught. And there's more, Holbrook added. We've begun processing the ranch. Early results show connections between CPF, Laffinger, and Rans to an international trafficking ring. The ranch, the cheerleading sponsorships, the catering, it's all a front. April nodded, weary but vindicated. We heard them talking about international shipments. That's why they always had armed guards. They were moving more than just food or supplies. The door opened again. The waitress from the diner entered, escorted by an officer. Her eyes were red, her hands trembling. I'm so sorry, she said, approaching Marissa and David. If I'd known, if I had understood what that earring meant. Marissa rose and embraced her. You helped save our daughter. You followed your gut and did the right thing. We owe you everything. The waitress reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver earring. This belongs to your family, she said, placing it in Marissa's palm. I don't deserve to keep it. Marissa closed her fingers around the tiny star-shaped piece. It had led them to April, a 20-year mystery unraveled by a chance encounter, a brave hiker, and a mother's refusal to give up. Thank you, she whispered, holding back tears. An officer stepped in. The hiker. Mr. Delaney asked me to pass along a message. He said to tell you he and Dusty are rooting for your family, and if you ever need anything, you know where to find him. Marissa smiled faintly. We'll never forget him. He's glad you're safe, the officer added, offering a small smile. He's the one who noticed you were missing and alerted us. He and the waitress came to the station together when they realized you might have followed her out to Laffinger Ranch. Marissa nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She made a silent promise to herself she would thank Chris Delaney properly the first chance she got. Without his sharp observation, his decision to report the abandoned car, and the quiet determination that led him to come forward, she and David might never have been found. Worse, they might never have found April. Chris's dog Dusty, that sun-bleached desert, and a chance hike had set in motion the unraveling of a 20-year nightmare. As they stepped out of the interview room, they passed open doors leading to other rooms where similar, long-awaited reunions were taking place. In one room, Kira Thompson sat between her parents, Linda and Robert, both of whom were sobbing openly, their hands never leaving their daughters, as if afraid she might vanish again if they let go. In another, Hannah Lee sat quietly, her father Michael kneeling in front of her, tears running freely down his face as he clutched her hands. Her mother, Judith, had died 3 years ago, never knowing her daughter had survived. The thought of that loss, so final and cruel, made Marissa's heart ache. Then, In the main lobby of the station, she spotted a gathering of officers gently speaking to Susan Collins and the Riveras. Marissa didn't need to hear the words. They were in the parents' faces, in the sudden collapse of Susan's body into a waiting chair, in the anguished cries that pierced the ambient hum of the police station like a blade. The sound froze the air around them. It was a reminder that even now, in the midst of reunion and rescue, not every family would leave this station whole. April stopped walking. Tears filled her eyes as she looked across the room. "I wish I could have saved them," she said softly, voice trembling. "Rachel, Amber, Lily. They deserve to come home too." David stepped closer and gently touched her shoulder. "You survived, April," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You kept the truth alive. Because of you, their stories won't disappear. The men who did this, they'll answer for every single life they destroyed." Marissa pulled April into her arms once more, holding her tight. The road ahead would be hard, filled with healing and grief, but right now, in this fleeting moment, they were whole again.